Hello there and a very good morning to you. We're live in London and you're listening to Monocle on Sunday with me, Emma Nelson. Coming up today, my guests will share their views on the week's biggest stories. Stephen Dalziel and Yossi Mekelberg are standing by. Good morning, gents. Yossi, what have you spotted?
Well, first of all, the horrific earthquake in Myanmar and how much it could help had US aid was still functioning. Why we shouldn't use signal when we are actually talking about bombing other countries. The worsening situation in Israel, whether it comes to democracy or the war in Gaza. And last and not least, how face recognition can help you to save yourself from fraud.
Thank you very much indeed for that. We'll be checking in with our Istanbul correspondent too.
I'm Lucinda Smith, and coming up, I'll be bringing you all the latest news from Turkey, including the protests over the arrest of the Istanbul mayor, the big getaway at the start of the Eid holiday, and the new train line that's running to the east of Turkey.
Plus, we'll hear from our editorial director, Brûlé, who brings us the latest from Venice. It's the 30th of March, 2025. Live from London, this is Monocle on Sunday.
Live from London, this is Monocle on Sunday with Emma Nelson.
And a very good morning to you. If you've just tuned in, for some people the clocks have gone forward. So we're not going to bore you with conversations about how adults are unable to function without trying to set 3 alarms. But it means that if you've just woken up in Zurich, for example, we are an hour ahead now. So a very good morning to you. And a very good morning to Stephen and to Yossi, also struggling to set alarms last night. We are fully functioning human beings. What is our problem?
Well, I had to do a Google check to make sure that if I put 6:15 into my iPhone, it would go off at the new 6:15 and not the old 6:15. I was mocked by my wife. She said, "You didn't know that?" I said, "Well, you always tell me just do a Google check." So
we have some manual clocks in our house and that caused utter chaos. How about you, Yossi?
I by now I know that it's only the oven that doesn't change automatically. So don't plan anything on the oven accordingly, but the rest did.
Don't plan your life around Yossi's oven.
No.
Excellent advice. Other than that, a good week held by you both? Yossi?
Yes, mine started off in Canada, actually. So I've had twice now experienced the clocks going forward by an hour because they went forward 3 weeks ago when we were in Canada. It was very interesting, actually, in so much as, let's get a little bit political, because, of course, everyone in Canada is talking with steam coming out of their ears about them becoming the 51st state, which they certainly don't want. And I then came back to find that my oldest school friend, who now lives in the States and was over here and came to stay for a couple of days, and we had, obviously, deep and meaningful discussions about the situation of America. And I said to him, "Peter, you might think I'm, completely off the wall, but what do you think about, is there any danger of civil war in Russia, in America?" He said, "Absolutely."
Right. Okay.
So it's all a bit scary.
They are taking it very, very seriously. How about you, Yossi?
Yeah, it's interesting to visit the 51st state of the United States. But no, I think the highlight was go to the theater, so involved with everything political, to go and actually watch Dear England in the National Theatre, which combined two things that I love, which theatre and football, which was very much about also life and success and failure, how you deal with that. So this was good. And going to see The Who in a concert, which until a few days ago, I didn't know they were still playing. But
no, they were still alive.
and apparently, so I'm going to see The Who.
Wonderful. So celebrations by all. Let us cross to Venice now, one of the most beautiful places on earth, to join our editorial director, Brûlé, who's just been to a wedding. Tyler, very good morning to you. How's Venice looking today?
Good morning. Buongiorno, Emma. Yeah, Venice is clearing skies right now. We have various rowing teams coming down the canal, so lots of gentlemen, a few ladies as well, in either like 6 or 4-person boats. This is where they're stand-up rowing, and I guess this is something of a Sunday procession. I think they've also, probably some hotels as well, seem to have also thrown a few oars at guests. It looks like they're also allowed to participate as well. Not so sure about that. But yes, a city definitely coming to life on a Sunday morning. Bells are ringing here, of course, just after 10 a.m. They've had no problems with the clocks here.
I can never get used. No, I think they probably do things properly over there when it comes to clocks. They have enough churches to sort of get things right. But is there still that absolute otherworldliness to Venice when you I can never quite believe it still exists every time I go there.
It's true. When you land, and of course you make your way across the lagoon, and you emerge in this place, and yes, there are all of the issues of course. Well, I wouldn't say over tourism. We're at the end of March, so it's not. They're just coming into high season is about to kick off, so they're somewhat braced. But I arrived just on I would say a normal Saturday afternoon. It was not great weather yesterday, and it's just those basic things when you see. Of course, it's rubbish collection when an ambulance boat speeds past, and I'm always curious to count how many people it takes, of course, to run an ambulance, and it seems to be 5. So you just think, of course, the costs that go with it. But I'm always then thinking about what about someone in how do you get someone down who's had a heart issue, whatever it may be, on a 5-floor walk-up in Venice. At least often there are grand staircases in many palazzi, but what if you're not in that space? How does that work? And then, of course, getting people onto the ambulance and then into the hospital is always fascinating. And that is that otherworldly side to all of it, that this still exists, that no one has either shut the place down or just said, let's just make it Disney and not have any regular residents living here.
It is that contrast with the fact that it's fully functioning, not to mention that those ambulances, they bounce around quite a lot, and they often complain about ambulances on land, which are bad enough. But to be in a bit of a mess and being on an ambulance is bad enough, but to be waterborne on a choppy afternoon on the lagoon is something that I wouldn't want to visit on my worst enemy.
No, that is the remarkable thing when you make the journey in from the airport and just the Vaporetti sort of speeding past, sort of crashing through the wakes, etc. Yeah. If you'd been medevaced and then had to be taken to the hospital here, completely different story.
Let's move on to happier things. You went to a wedding yesterday, and I cannot imagine how magical a wedding must be in Venice.
Yeah, well, this is, I don't want to call it a racket, but what a business. And I was just commenting last night that if you have, a wedding, whether it's 80 people, 200 people, and you've got, 5 or 6 of them going on in the city on any given weekend, what an economic driver for the city and the region, just how many room nights, the catering, all the things that go with it. So yes, very, very important. This is my second wedding in Venice in the last, I would say, 6-7 months. And this is a completely new format. So listeners, pay attention. If anyone's getting hitched or if you have to pick up the bill for kids that are getting hitched soon, this is last night, friends from Lisbon. So I would say wedding of about 200 people. 90%, probably 80% of the people there had flown in from Lisbon, maybe a bit of Brazil, and then elsewhere from around the world, and it was so well done, beautiful palazzo, and just great. I mean, it's an open bar right away. So this is the first thing, open bar. Lots of handsome bartenders. Of course, you could get a nice, Franciacorta when you walked in. But the idea is that the party just started right away. Then there was a bit of maybe we have to rewind a little bit. Of course, it's Venice. They wanted an elegant, beautiful evening. So with the invite, and you might think this is a bit pushy, but it came with a mood board. So when they talked about doing elegant, chic Venetian, the guys and the girls probably had about 6 different looks to play with. Now that could range from dinner jacket. Of course, Emma, you would have loved it. A lot of capes involved last night. If you wanted to don a mask, you're allowed to, but I would say maybe only 5% of the guests did so. There was a grand entrance, of course, and then it just, this was amazing. We went up to this wonderful salon on the floor above. And you thought, okay, is it going to be a placement? What's it going to be? And it was just the most amazing buffet. There were tons of attendants, so no one was putting their grubby mitts. Not that people had grubby mitts, but of course, no one was sort of, just diving into the salads. There was people there to sort of serve you. And then there's just all these wonderful little groupings of seats, lots of sort of side rooms, et cetera. So it was just like, again, just a wonderful stand-up, sit-down, kind of rolling cocktail party. And then just the momentum of then, okay, have your food, have your dessert, and now you need to get down to the dance floor. And then, of course, another bar open. And it was just great, just wonderfully paced. And, of course, you could slip out into the Venetian evening whenever you wanted.
Amazing. I think one can only dream of something being so perfectly organised. I do want to know which bit of the mood board you went for.
I went for classic dinner jacket. There were no masks involved. There was no sort of headdresses from any samba schools because when you have a couple of Brazilians as well, and it comes to sort of playing dress up. So I would thought if there were some Venetians there, they might have been sort of mortified by what the Brazilians had done with some of the masks. Anyway, it all worked well, and one of the best bits was there was this fantastic woman had the most simple silk. It was sort of a cross between sort of a hairband, but it was just a massive sort of pasta shape on top. which was quite. But you had to study it. I mean, you looked at it first, going, "This is just an elegant bow," but it's just if you sort of studied the cream silk, you realized that it was something you'd find in a box of Brûlé.
Excellent, and you just please avoid the tomato sauce. Can we just briefly touch on capes? There are serious conversations being held in the Nelson household at the moment about capes, both for men and for women. I have one. I use it. I'm a big fan. But I don't know if you've heard about the Spanish cape company. I think they're called Senya.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I was in Paris a couple of weeks ago. You know that full well. But there was a gentleman in, I think it was the Grand Palais, near the Grand Palais. He was wearing a cape and he looked marvellous. There are standards, though, that you need to meet before you can pull it off.
Absolutely. And of course, Venice, like Madrid, and you get pockets of it also in Portugal as well. Where capes are still worn, and whether this is sort of, and it's interesting. I was thinking about Portugal. I was looking at some capes there, which are just part of what you wear during grape picking season when you're out in the vineyards. They're cut in a way so your knees aren't going to get caught when you have to maybe kneel down and trim some roots or whatever it is. So I just like that there's this whole language around it. And of course, capes are still part of uniforms in Italy. And again, not just ceremonial. I mean, you see the kind of Vigneti wearing capes. So I'm all for them. Anyone going to Venice, there's a great little company from around here called Canny, C-I-N-I. Who do just remarkable capes, and those ones that you would want to wear and sort of in daily life and not look ridiculous either. This
is it, the daily life, the pulling it off daily life thing, which is the big question. Hospitality in Venice is always, well, it's been more miss than hit recently, but then it's sort of really stepped up its game recently, hasn't it?
Well, there's just a number of, the Bower is being redone. The Daniele will become a Four Seasons here. So there's a whole reinvention going on. But I have to go back to just on the topic of capes just for one moment, because there's a whole other world, I think, that is also open. And there was a gentleman there wearing a fantastic turban as well, and turban with cape. And I thought, okay, this is very difficult to pull off with headphones in studio, but I thought it was such a good look. He was not from the Maghreb. He was not from the Indian subcontinent. It just looked. And there's something about also you can get away with this in Venice. But yeah, I was just thinking, when can I wear a turban? Okay,
when can you wear a turban? I mean, we're going to be transporting you back to Zurich next week, and I want to see which moment you're going to choose for the turban.
Yeah, well, we're going to work on it. We have to sort of engineer the event. It can't be sort of around sort of strict geography. That's part of sort of monthly life. We're going to have to build something out in Q4 this year where the turban can make an appearance. I don't know where to get. I don't even know where to get a turban. Anyway, we'll come back to that. I have to this is maybe a bit related to finding turbans, though. I'm staying at a place called Venice, which is a hotel. We've featured it in the magazine before. It's about my third stay here. Emma, this is just hotel done well. Hotel done well by people who probably didn't have a budget either. So the property is owned by the founders of the sneaker brand Golden Goose. They sold a large chunk of the business, of course, to a bigger player. They did very well, and I think they just said, we just need to have a hotel in Venice, and we won't even sort of think about what the budget is. So just beautifully, just exquisite rooms. But where they really excel is just the uniforms. You would love the amazing flowing sort of work skirts, the knitwear that the women wear. And then the guys working here, they just have these fantastic sort of a slightly cropped trouser, a short worker's jacket. Everyone is in a Venetian velvet slipper, so there's no one in a weird sort of service sneaker or anything like that. So everyone is just sort of padding around in fantastic slippers. But here's where it excels, is the retail. This is what I think is so smart, because they've got 3 shops. They have this sort of logomania sort of store where there's just like, Venice on all kinds of things you can get. You'd love it. There's a wonderful K-Way Cape style parka, which is with of course a rain hat to match. Then they have another shop which is more in the world of design and books and just fine objects. And then a wonderful women's and men's multi-brand store with brands that some that you might be familiar with, but most of it is just about discovery. Brands from Japan, Spain, Italy, etc. And the stores are just not packed, but the stores are just full of people who many are hotel guests. I think it's so clever because this is a way of, yes, room rates are high, but also, if you're a hotel owner, suddenly the guests who might have spent 700-800 euros a night on a room, I've also then spent another 700 or 800 euros just supporting your very finely curated gift shops as well.
So you've done good weddings, you've done good hospitality, you've done good turbans and capes. I'm wondering how they're going to work with a pair of with the trainers. I can't remember the goose trainers, and then how we're going to get on with how you run a nice company event. I mean, you have been on the road, and there's been a lot of Monocle, client-facing, public-facing events in the last couple of weeks, mostly in Paris, and you've come back to London to host an event here for the staff last week. And there were a few principles that came through there, that didn't there?
Yes, well, and you were, of course, witness to, I think, to the entire evening. So, and this is just maybe another lesson, because we've come to the end of course, of Q1 this year. And I would imagine many people who are managing businesses or running divisions, there's probably that moment of regrouping, looking forward, what's going to happen, of course, for the next 3 quarters across the year. So we do this thing called the Mingler, and oftentimes we bring in external speakers to talk to the whole company, or of course, we have other staff members who do presentations. But this year we sort of went Pechakucha style, like from Japan. And everybody had to, it was almost like speed dating. Everyone had 5 minutes to go and talk about their certain assignment or to report on something that they've been up to. So Natalie Teodosi, our fashion editor, she had to do just 5 minutes, whiz around, Petit Uomo in Florence, men's shows in Milan, women's shows in Milan, also Paris as well, across a series of slides. Sophie had to talk about the new issue of Confect. Andrew, plus our Carlotta, plus Luke had to do a 5-minute presentation on being at MIPIM, the big real estate and property exhibition in Cannes. And I mean, you saw the format. It was great. There's a certain levity. We know the importance of also being on the clock, and I'm sure you're looking at a clock right now because we have to get on with the rest of the program. But it worked. It just worked incredibly well. So I can highly recommend this format for anyone who has to do management presentations as we come to the end of Q1.
From good weddings to golden goose trainers to turbans to how to organise a company gathering. Thank you so much, Tyler Brûlé, for your time. Enjoy the rest of your weekend in Venice. Gentlemen, let's go back to our panel. Stephen Dalziel and Yossi Mekelberg. Yossi, you were smiling there because you have just had to organise your daughter's wedding.
Well, the lucky thing, I didn't have to organise it. I happened to enjoy it. Because both my daughter Nat and our husband Tom are wonderful organizers. They live in Scotland and decided to have their wedding in Scotland, in Loch Lomond, and it's even the weather, was helpful and was a beautiful sunny day. But everything was organized to perfection. It was between really gorgeous place in Loch Lomond, but at the same time family, friends. Even the food was kind of family style, indie band playing for a few hours, dancing, and it's just a marvelous weekend.
The organisation is absolutely key here, isn't it, Stephen? That I know that my wedding we organised in a morning because we just got everybody in the same place, and we were in a different country, so we needed to keep it super simple for absolutely everybody. But the fact is that we maybe it's because so coming from a family of broadcasters, we are very good at persuading people to do things at short notice for not very much and to sort of play along and have lots of fun with it. And it kind of pulled off. You had minimal organisation for your wedding, didn't you?
Absolute minimal organisation, yes. We called it the Nike marriage. We just did it. But actually, I wanted to hearing Tyler, I hate to out Tyler, but in 2011, my wife and I we were invited to a wedding in Venice. But this wedding started with a champagne reception at 6:00 on the Friday, followed by a recital in a church just off St Mark's Square. We were then taken in boats across the lagoon for an outdoor dinner. The wedding itself was on Saturday afternoon and went on late into the early hours of Sunday morning. And then we went for a sort of post-wedding breakfast, which started at 12 o'clock in the Hotel Europa. And we were leaving for the airport, picking up our luggage and seeing that some of the guests were still there at 8 o'clock that evening. So that was a really splendid wedding. And I was reminded, hearing Tyler, of a friend of mine from BBC days who was talking about someone else who'd got married, and who said very earnestly, yes, she married very well. Divorced now, of course.
Grief. Oh, that's shame. But the idea of transporting people to a different place is a really, really, it's not necessarily a dangerous one, but it doesn't come risk-free, does it? That you don't know who's going to come to your wedding, that you're going to cast. You have to keep it small. You can't have like a cast of thousands coming to a wedding. And we had a tiny wedding that was only about 40 of us. But the idea that people who, the ones you love and the ones who love you will be the ones who get on that plane and who commit. But then when they get there, you have to give them what Stephen just said, a few days fun here, a dinner there, breakfast there. It sort of becomes a bit of a tour operation. So the wedding, like I say, took a morning to organise, and the rest was all just coaches and no, there were no coaches, but it was boat trips and all that kind of stuff. That becomes the bigger job, doesn't it?
Yeah, the Americans call it out-of-town dinner. Everyone that comes. And like in the United States, where I got married, you have people, everyone is out of town, especially if you get married in a small place. And everyone travels endless out. But the same in Scotland, let alone during war, when there are no flights. And some of the people came to my daughter's wedding to find all sorts of strange routes to get to the UK.
Because some of them were coming from Israel. So they couldn't fly out.
They eventually all sorts of routes through Greece, through Germany, and some of them had extended holiday of another week or two just because they couldn't fly back. So it was an extended celebration with family.
But then, of course, the other thing you have to be very careful of is offending people by not inviting them.
Yeah.
However far away it is, if you don't invite them. That's why, my wife and I, we had the ideal wedding in that we didn't invite anyone.
You even had
we just did it.
You had to grab witnesses.
We had to grab a couple of witnesses, yes, because I hadn't even invited them.
Wonderful. That's great. Let's move on to some of the stories that we've got to talk about today. Yossi, straight away, New York Times headline this morning is "Should I Fire Him?" Inside Trump's deliberations over the fate of Michael Waltz. This is going back to the quite jaw-dropping story about how a senior journalist managed to find himself on a group chat with the most powerful men in America, deciding at what point they were going to bomb Houthi rebels in Yemen.
Yeah, I saw in the article you see how long is to read it, and says 5 minutes, and I thought the answer is yes to whether to fire him or not. You don't need a 5 minutes read to know that. Anyone that served in the military or been in any security forces for much less than that, you spend time in military jail for doing something along these lines, let alone exposing time, location, who is going to do what, where you got the intelligence from. Now we know some of it came from Israel, all the package, and all of doing that on signal and not secured line. And this, all what it tells us, those are a bunch of amateurs. But not only amateur, arrogant amateurs, that they think they are already ruling the world before we just take Canada, Greenland, Panama, trade, tariffs, all of this. We can actually do it all on not secure lines and talk about things like this. And it's just so how inexperienced they are and at the same time arrogant about it. And this is putting risk. every former head of CIA and intelligence community, probably was in complete shock that they will actually discuss in details an attack on the Houthis in Yemen or any other place when that they prepare, it might cost the life of American pilots, they can fear for retaliation. So that's why I said the answer whether to fire not only him, the lot of them, let alone, of course, adding a journalist, Jeffrey Goldberg of all people, that I don't think he's a great Trump supporter, and to add to this group, this kind of tops the cherry on the top.
The interesting part about the New York Times article, well, there's many interesting parts about it, but it examines how the Trump administration reacts to crisis the second time round. And it highlights the fact that Mr. Waltz may indeed keep his job because there is this culture of doubling down, denying no matter how problematic things are, by saying it's all fine, it's nothing. It sort of worked for the Trump administration last time around, but it may be harder this time around because not only is the Trump administration more ready for government, reporters and the rest of the world is more ready for a second round of Trump. And the fact that Mr. Waltz was denying meeting the Atlantic journalist, and then someone just said, hang on, I've got a photograph of him in the French embassy in Washington in 2021. This constant stream of denials doesn't seem to be sticking this time round.
I hope not. I as Yossi was just saying, there's so much wrong with this at a very serious level. First of all, as Yossi was saying, the fact that so much classified information was put on Signal, then the journalist is included by mistake. And then, of course, what they tried to do is exactly what you're saying. The first reaction was to come out against the journalist and and insult him and say he's lying. So what does he do? He said goes and publishes everything he's fired. I think it was brilliant. But I don't know. I admire your optimism, Emma, but I'm worried. I must admit. I think this lot feel they can get away with anything, and if heads don't roll after this, and it seems that they probably won't, then we really are in a worrying situation because they feel that they are almighty. They can do anything. They can say anything. They can lie. Dealing with Russia and dealing with Putin, I'm used to someone who lies and lies and lies, even when you can prove that it's a lie. That doesn't bother Putin. It doesn't seem to bother Trump or his chums either, and that worries me. I very much fear what's coming next. If they can do this, where next?
There's also an issue that was raised by J.D. Vance, Vice President, who's heading to, I think he was in Greenland this week with his wife, wondering whether at what point they're going to have it. He was asked, for his reaction to what was going on, and he says, if you think you're going to force the President of the United States to fire anybody, you've got another thing coming. President Trump has said it, that he's, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and we're standing behind our entire national security team. That is a Putin playbook, isn't it?
It's absolutely, yeah, it's completely. This is the more that Trump does these things, the more you think that both he and Putin have read George Orwell's 1984 and have not seen it as a warning. They've seen it as a guidebook for what they should do. I can see behind both Trump and Putin this idea from 1984. You divide the world into three major powers. In this case, it's America, Russia, and China. Two will always be allies. One will always be the enemy. The next day it might change, and so therefore they change and rewrite history. It is frighteningly close to 1984.
And when you look at them from, let's say, from an Israeli point of view, if Netanyahu's looking at this in Israel at this precise moment, what? The play, as Stephen was saying, the playbook comes from 1984. Then the three huge superpower leaders then take it as a guidebook. Then that starts to send extra messages and signals out to other leaders who quite fancy keeping in power no matter what.
If I may just say, perceptually, I think Trump is worse than Putin, because Putin talks about his neighbors. Trump is talking about, not only Canada. He goes as far as Greenland and Panama. So in his head, I'm not saying in practice, he goes even further than Putin. Whether he will going to do that or not, it's a different question. But back to your question, I think Netanyahu thinks that he is on a winning streak now, because he almost helped save Netanyahu. He helped him first with the first phase of the hostages, but then helped him also to stop it, and then to restore his coalition and even enlarge his coalition. Now that all of a sudden he legitimized and normalized the idea of basic, what they call voluntary immigration from Gaza. It's not voluntary. It doesn't exist. It's a transfer. It's forcing people out of Gaza, 2.3 million. So again, all of a sudden, we can resolve the demographic issue in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We just throw 2.3 million people to Egypt, to Jordan. They even talk about Africa, Sudan, Somalia. And at the same time, probably the settler already think Trump was on our side. Maybe we can think similarly in the West Bank. So from Israel. But the one thing that if anyone, any sense, Trump can flip-flop in 5 seconds. The minute someone will sketch him one way or another, it will all turn against them. So I think Netanyahu is playing a dangerous game, but he's playing dangerous game because he's on a survival mode to stay in power.
Thank you for that, Yossi. The time here in London is 9:31. Let's head now to Istanbul. Our correspondent, Lucinda Smith, is standing by. Good morning, Hannah.
Morning.
How is Istanbul looking this morning? I mean, the headlines for the last few days have been very much focused on huge protests against the arrest and detention of Ekrem İmamoğlu. But in terms of the atmosphere in Turkey's biggest city, how does it feel?
Well, it's a strange one, Emma, because actually today's the start of the Bayram or Eid holiday, which is, it's the equivalent of Christmas Day here in Turkey. So the streets are hauntingly empty, although they'll get fuller later in the day. But just yesterday, we had a huge rally by the opposition in Maltepe on the Asian side of Istanbul. Hundreds of thousands of people turned out to that to hear Özgür Özel, who's the party leader of the CHP, Ekrem İmamoğlu's party. Ekrem İmamoğlu, of course, is the mayor of Istanbul, who was detained on March the 19th, has since been charged with corruption offences. There's also terrorism charges still open against him. He's now in Silivri prison on the outskirts of Istanbul. And his arrest has sparked nights of just growing and furious protests. We've seen really a sort of a tale of two protests each night, and also yesterday as well. We have the kind of main events that are organised by the opposition party, where opposition leaders like Özel, also Dilek İmamoğlu, İmamoğlu's wife, speaking to the crowd. But then once those events are finished, we see the police moving in very heavy-handedly with tear gas, with rubber bullets, to disperse the crowds. And in particular, the kind of Gen Z protesters, the students, are staying on the streets. They're saying it doesn't matter if the opposition party, calls an end to their demonstrations. We're going to stay here until İmamoğlu is released from prison.
And what is the likelihood of that happening? Because there is always the sense that Erdogan quite likes to double down when faced with a crisis like this.
Well, we just have to look at other examples to realise that it is not likely that İmamoğlu is going to be released while Erdogan is still in power. Other politicians, Selahattin Demirtas, the very popular Kurdish leader he was until 2016, and even after his arrest in 2016, the leader of the HDP, the main Kurdish party, like İmamoğlu, very charismatic, young, a lawyer, was building a big kind of support base, not only amongst Kurds, but also amongst liberal Turks. He was arrested in 2016 on terrorism charges and has remained in prison since then.
And we now have, sorry to interrupt, we now have 100 journalists being arrested trying to get into Turkey to try to report on what is going on. So we have this urgent feeling that your voice is going to be even more important because the ability for people to report on what was going on is being curtailed.
Yeah, absolutely. Turkey has never been an easy place to be a journalist. So, in the past decade, it's regularly topped the list for the biggest jailer of journalists. Then as now that generally applies to, Turkish journalists. And in the early days of these protests, we saw several very high profile Turkish journalists, including a photojournalist called Bülent Kılıç, who worked with AFP. If you've read news from Turkey, Syria, the Middle East over the past decade, you will have seen Bülent Kılıç's photographs. But then, as you mentioned also, now we're seeing, not the detention of journalists who are based here like myself, but journalists who are coming in from other places being deployed. The Turkish government says they're not getting the appropriate press accreditation to cover these protests. And including the BBC's Mark Lowen, he was based here for 5 years as the Turkey correspondent. He came back earlier this week to cover the protests, and then after a few days was detained for 17 hours and then deported from the country. So a really kind of swift crackdown on both local and international media.
And the way that Turkey and indeed the authorities are managing the fact that you have this enormous festival today. We have Bayram, and which is known in lots of other places as Eid. We have that happening, so you're going to get gatherings on the street, but also the authorities are going to want to keep control of any kind of protest against the detention of Imamoglu. I mean, how does that work, and how do you move freely around the streets, and how does Istanbul navigate this?
Sure. Well, I mean, Eid's come at a blessed time for Erdogan, and he's never one to let an opportunity pass by. So the government's announced a 9-day holiday. Eid or Bayram lasts for 3 days. That's the religious holiday, but the whole week and weekends around it. So actually the holiday started yesterday. And what they've done is they've closed the student dormitories. So a lot of the students who are protesting in places like Istanbul will be forced to go to their hometowns. So I think they're hoping that might sort of dampen down the protests, at least for a few days. But yeah, navigating Istanbul has been tricky over the past few days. Taksim metro station in Taksim Square, which, if you know Istanbul, is the absolute heart of the city. That's been closed down. And in fact, the whole square has just been closed off. The protesters had been wanting to march from Istanbul City Hall to Taksim, which is a short distance, and had been completely blocked by the police. So that's been difficult. There was one night as well when all the roads in and out of Istanbul going to City Hall were also closed. There were restrictions on people coming in and out of the city. So it's been very difficult. But what usually happens in Bayram is the first day today, very quiet. People are seeing their families, going to visit, graves of relatives who've passed on. And then the 2 days after that become very, very busy. So we will see what happens in 2 days ahead.
Hannah, have you ever known a moment like this in Turkey?
Interestingly enough, I arrived in Turkey completely by chance a couple of months before the Gezi Park protests in 2013, which was the last time you had these kind of mass youth-led movements, which led to a huge, weeks-long sit-in in Taksim Square, and was a huge, huge challenge to Erdogan, the biggest challenge he had faced at that time, which is why he cracked down on it so harshly. In the end, the police came in with tear gas, they dispersed the protesters in the square, and then after that, in the 12 years since, there's been this increasing political crackdown. Huge waves of arrests against alleged Gezi collaborators who are then charged with constitutional crimes and handed life sentences in a lot of cases. Then after the coup attempt against Erdogan in 2016, again, another wave of crackdowns. A lot of Turks, opposition Turks, young Turks have left the country. And it sort of felt like protests had died a bit. There's been a lot to protest about, particularly the economy. The economy has been going terribly for the past 5 years. And the arrest of Imamoglu hasn't come out of the blue. There's been, arrests and sackings of mayors, particularly in Kurdish regions, since 2019, and cases against Imamoglu, investigations against him have been going on since 2019 when he first won the office in Istanbul. So, it sort of felt like, the discontent was there, the sort of frustration was bubbling, but people were very, very scared. And rightly so. We've seen, I think now almost 3,000 people arrested for taking part in these protests. Police, you can see at the protest, the police is sort of at the front filming faces. And then they go in dawn raids and round people up. And that's why a lot of the young people are covering their faces. Even older people, I see sort of, middle-aged couples going and covering their faces at these demonstrations as well. So, yeah, it's in one sense, it's very, very reminiscent of Gezi. But the circumstances in Turkey around it are completely different. It's a far more polarized, fractured, angry country. And Erdogan at this point has a lot more control of his party, of the security forces, and also of the state institutions as well.
This is a sad situation for a country which is so attractive to foreign visitors and does sort of soft power so well. I think one thing that you wanted to touch on is a train which demonstrates just how well the Turks do this, and trying to place this in the context of what is happening at the moment in Turkey is very hard, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I mean, this is Turkey's tragedy, and also another of Erdogan's trump cards is that it is so attractive, culturally. It's a great holiday destination, but also diplomatically, it occupies this place in diplomacy where Erdogan can do this kind of mediating role, particularly between, Russia and Ukraine. And Europe needs Turkey, particularly at this point when Donald Trump's sort of pulling America away from the Atlantic Alliance. But yeah, the tourists do still keep coming to Turkey. And on April the 11th, one of Turkey's newest train routes that opened last year, it's called the Mesopotamia Express, will reopen for tourists. So it runs from Ankara to Diyarbakir, which is the kind of de facto capital of Turkey's Kurdish region in the southeast. Runs for 26 hours. It's a sleeper train. And very quickly it opened last year. It was on Time magazine's 100 greatest trips to do in the world. So yeah, Turkey's going to be hoping that it's going to be another bumpy year for tourism, both in the coastal resorts and also these kind of more off the track attractions.
Hannah Lucinda Smith in Istanbul, thank you so much for joining us today. You're listening to Monocle on Sunday with me, Emma Nelson, joined in the studio by Stephen Dalziel and Yossi Mekelberg. Stephen, listening to that, we hear this idea that Erdogan is emboldened by his global position at the moment. He's managed to position himself, and we've talked about this before, but the skill with which he manoeuvres internationally is quite breathtaking, not least his relationship with Russia.
Indeed. We were really going through the dictators this morning. We've had Trump, we've had Putin, we've had Netanyahu, now we've got on to Erdogan. I think what leapt out at me from what your correspondent was saying was 3,000 people arrested, and the fact that they're using facial recognition technology, which we might come on to later about something in a completely different way, but to round people up the next day. So no wonder people are, not only youngsters covering their faces. This is classic dictatorship. The BBC correspondent who was expelled this week after 3 days because he was a threat to security, which is of course nonsense. I mean, dictators don't need real reasons for doing what they do. I find it very worrying. I think Erdogan's been in power for 22 years, which by any standards is generally thought to be too long. Democracy suffers, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely, which may be a cliche, but I think it's true. And where does Turkey go from here? And yet you've got Erdogan playing this role between Russia and Ukraine. To some extent, with a little bit of success, you've got the tourists saying, "Oh well, never mind what's going on. We're going to go there anyway because the sun shines and you've got this fantastic train journey now." He seems to, at the moment, be able to juggle things quite well.
Not juggling so well when it comes to the Turkish relationship with Israel. It always on a knife edge. But there seems to be signs now that it is, Syria being a big problem, but also this constant problem that Israel and Turkey have with each other.
Obviously, what happened in Syria is a coup for Erdogan and his ability actually to quash also the Kurdish issue, at least for now. But Israel responded in a way that taking parts of Syria, and I think using excessive force in other places, and we know when Israel says that it's a temporary measure, we might still discuss it in 20 years' time, that there are still Israeli troops inside what's called now the Syrian Golan Heights, and this might lead to fracture. But we know since 2010 and then the Marmara incident, the relations between Turkey and Israel are on a knife edge. In principle, Turkey and Israel are allies. And whenever you talk to diplomats or military security people, say Israel and Turkey needs each other. The the security coordination, the political one is important. But when you have two populist leaders that thrive on conflict, and they always need enemy, Netanyahu and Erdogan just find each other as the perfect enemies.
Let's move on to news that's been covered for the last couple of days, which is this devastating earthquake in Myanmar. They have now 1,600 reported to have been killed, but the junta in Myanmar has now control of less than half of the territory that it has, because rebels and indeed the people of Myanmar are pushing back against the regime. But Myanmar is now calling urgently for international help. And there are real fears, aren't there, Stephen, that if that help is given, it will not reach the people who need it. That's
the real fear. I mean, it's terrible to think that actually this earthquake could help the junta. We've already had reports in the last 24, 48 hours. They've been bombing the rebels in areas which are devastated by the earthquake. I mean, any regime that can do that, there's got to be something seriously wrong with it. Yes, they've called on the international community to help, but as you say, who knows where the aid will go. The trouble is also, because it's such a closed country, it's very difficult really to know. A few videos have come out of buildings collapsing or having collapsed and so on. But I wonder if we'll ever find out the true state of the devastation that's been struck. If a tower block that was being built in Bangkok 1,000 kilometres away can collapse, and the other things that have happened in Bangkok because of the earthquake, what about at the epicenter? I mean, it's very difficult to picture what the destruction must be like. And then they go and get bombed as well. This, as I say, ironically, could actually help the junta, which is a terrible thing to say.
One wonders what the international community must do to help. How it helps? Well, because if it does help, as we don't know what will happen.
One thing is, it can also work against the junta there, because when there is major crisis, it exposes how incompetent they are, and it actually might bring the opposition forces that are not united together. But maybe it's a wishful thinking on my side. Maybe I might be wrong. But you need the international community. But it also reminds me, when I hear about this kind of disaster, a good friend of mine, he wrote his PhD on major disasters. He won't deal with less than 100,000 people affected and above. And he actually was in Myanmar when there was a disaster more than a decade ago. And he would always tell me, forget about the international community. You need to bring people with expertise, and you'll find everything that you need within the vicinity. If you need blankets, if you need medication, you need someone that can tell you what is the generic medication, and they will find it over there and much cheaper. Having big storage and this somewhere else, by the time it arrives there, it's too late. So you need to send rescue forces immediately there, people that understand the place. One of the problems right now that a major humanitarian agency, USAID, basically doesn't exist anymore. And those are the people with expertise. They can go, in different places and all the locality, and they've just been completely demolished by the Trump administration.
That is something that's being reported widely today, isn't it? The fact that the international community and its ability to help has changed.
Indeed. And I thought it was very significant that as of tomorrow, China will be sending apparently a large amount of aid. But I mean, what's happened with USAID is just appalling. I mean, throughout the world, even something particularly relevant in my field is the fact that Voice of America and Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty are no longer broadcasting. I mean, talk about opening up a broadcasting opportunity for propaganda for Russia and China. There is talk that Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, which of course have been doing fantastic work for years, and I say that as someone who was effectively part of the competition in BBC World Service, but they do a great job. They moved from Munich to Prague after the fall of communism, and there is talk that somehow the Czechs are going to take it over and keep it broadcasting. But the fact they have to do this, I mean, we come back again to Trump and the madness of what he's doing. I want to kind of pick up a very sort of small point as well, completely irrelevant from anything else. But I noticed that it's a linguistic point. And Emma, you said junta, so I followed it with junta. And then Yossi very correctly said junta, because of course it is a Spanish word. But so where do we get to the point where language switches? Do we say, because we don't say Paris, we say Paris in English. So should we say junta? And I'm divided on that one. I felt when Yossi said junta, I felt I should have said junta.
Which is right, Yossi. We've got it wrong, says Stephen.
It's because, as you know, I used to do research work on Cuba and revolutions. So I got used when using the word junta and not junta. So because that's where it comes from.
Either way, however you call it, it is devastating given the fact that they have now said that they're going to start running elections in the next few months, which is what they were going to do anyway. And this idea that a country that was already in an absolute mess and, with effectively the government bombing its own people is now going to be cut off from the rest of the world. And we may never know what is happening. We may never be able to help with what's happening in Myanmar.
It might take years, and we know about the refugee crisis in Myanmar, and the political crisis that it went from semi-democratic to again to led by military dictatorship. But at the end of the day, it shows also the failure of the international community, the inability to respond. When we're trying. They talk about taking Greenland and Panama and all of this, but we have place like Myanmar for so many years, and with people in San Suu Kyi that reached agreement and was elected democratically and tried to run the country differently, and then the military breaks all agreements there, and the international community is completely useless and helpless in responding to it.
And tell me a little bit more. I mean, this leads on to an article that you've written this week about how democracies don't just disappear, that they are, I think I'm quoting you, that they are gradually eroded from within by their enemies. I mean, this is a wider problem, isn't it?
It is, and we see how democracy, dictatorship just collapsed, they're shattered. We saw it like in Syria. It's like a glass. It looks very strong, and when it's gone, it shatters into pieces. That's the Bashar Assad example. What we see right now in Israel, it's legislation by legislation, firing after firing of the gatekeeper, if it's the Attorney General, attacking the judiciary. According to one report, since the sixth Netanyahu government came to power just over 2 years ago, there were 300 anti-democratic pieces of legislation put on the Knesset. Not all of them passed. Then you look at the budget, which is a no confidence or confidence vote in Israel, it completely shifts the balance towards the less democratic elements, more money to settlement. I think one of the biggest mistakes, and I might have said it there, is that many Israelis that protested against the judiciary, what they call reform, but for me it's an assault on democracy, forget that there is a direct link between the occupation and having one set of legal system, which is a military one, and 5 minutes away from there, the so-called the precious democracy. And they try to defend democracy in one side, forgetting there are millions of people that living under a military rule that can be arrested and detained in the middle of the night. And we saw, for instance, what happened with one of the creator of the documentary, No Other Land, that won the Oscar recently. He was beaten up by settlers, probably by soldiers, disappeared for a few days, and that's what military rule can do. So the idea that you can separate between the occupation and democracy and preserve it one side and not in the other was always an illusion. And I hope Israeli people will wake up, and there will be even bigger demonstration that we see now, because when I wrote this, I thought about Don McLean, the day the music died. And I thought about it this in the day that democracy dies, when you have all of a sudden in 1 week, all of this happening at the same time, getting rid of the Attorney General and the head of the Shin Bet that investigates the Prime Minister, and a piece of legislation that gives politicians the power to appoint judges, and then, maybe the game is up.
Yeah, we have the rule of law. The separation of powers starts to crumble. At the beginning of the programme, Stephen, you said that you'd been in Canada, which is, fighting incredibly publicly in terms of the little things that Canadians are able to do. Impossible to get an American bottle of wine on a Canadian shelf anymore. It was just like, okay, we're shutting, we're going to send crazy messages out there. But there is this determination, isn't there, in the light of very open attacks on democracy that Trump is engaging in, not least trying to rewrite history. That's one of the great cultural threats that you suddenly find.
Yeah, it is. And, as I mentioned at the start, this idea that Canada could become the 51st state. Yeah, we had lots of conversations with lots of different people, and this was one thing that everyone said, this is outrageous. We aren't. And, Canadians, I love Canada, and I love Canadians. They're so polite, they're so friendly. And yet this is one thing that's really getting people angry. And, when we spoke in support of them. I've been very impressed with the way Mark Carney became Prime Minister while we were there. I mean, he hasn't been officially sworn in, but he effectively became Prime Minister. And the way he's spoken out and actually said, we're not going to be pushed around by America, that is really resonating. And in the hotel, we watched quite a lot of, in the morning and evening, we turned on the news to watch the Canadian news, CBC, which I think presents the news very well. It was very much this idea that, right, we're going to be tough over this. We're going to be strong, we're not going to let America walk all over us. The feeling is that when people have got fed up with Justin Trudeau, the now former Prime Minister, the Conservatives were very much in the ascendancy, and Donald Trump has swung it completely, and there'll be an election, obviously, on the 28th of April, which has been called by Carney, and everyone expects the Liberals to win now.
We've got 45 seconds to talk about whiskey, Yossi.
Yes, it's actually something that investigation by the BBC that's managed to expose kind of a sham and try to defraud people through setting a company that sells whiskey casks, but they didn't exist or been overpriced. And the interesting thing is the BBC investigate found it through face recognition. So we are not very happy with face recognition when we walk in the streets and everyone knows. But in this case, it helped to expose some fraud and probably save people a lot of money.
Thank you very much indeed for that, and neatly put. Yossi Mekelberg and Stephen Dalziel, thank you so much for joining me on today's programme. And thanks also to Hannah Lucinda Smith and Tyler Brûlé. The programme was produced by Desi Bandley and Mariella Bevan, and our studio engineer was Mariella Bevan too. I'm Emma Nelson. Monocle on Sunday's back at the same time next week. But until then, enjoy the rest of your weekend.